Well, thank you all for coming. I'm just gonna, I wasn't expecting to be up here. The first time I actually went to a con ever was Hackfest a couple of years ago. So this is the second time I've been back, and it's pretty surreal to be speaking up here. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy my next hour rant on cyber warfare, also known as war in the fifth dimension. And I'm going to be giving you a bit of an overview of some of the problems that we face when we sort of investigate what cyber warfare is and how we deal with it. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. I accidentally deleted my About Me slide. So, I'll talk a bit about myself. I do some pen testing at Security Compass. So our booth is out there. If you haven't seen it, go say hi. In the past, I did healthcare governance, and I also did a bachelor's degree, which I just finished recently, and that's actually why I have this research, because I did this as my capstone. So I'm pretty happy to be able to bring it to a bigger stage now. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the experience of going through the research before I get into the nitty-gritty stuff. So, when you start research, you think it's going to be pretty simple, right? Like, you pick a topic, you do the research, you make a report out of it, and then, it's going to be fine. It's going to be like the greatest thing. That's not how it goes. When you start out researching such a broad topic as cyber warfare, you feel a little bit like this. And I think you all know how this meme goes, right? You think, oh, if you just Google cyber and war, it's going to be fine. Like, you'll find exactly what you want. It's not like that. As you keep, you start to find out that there's a million different terms that people agree or disagree on what cyber warfare should be called. A lot of them say, it's actually cyber terrorism or cyber espionage, and cyber warfare doesn't exist, and that we're actually, just part of a giant Cold War that's happening already. And then you find out there's a massive 600 page rule book about how this is supposed to happen, but none of the definitions in the book are actually accurate. And then you're reading about weird stuff exactly how many kilometers under the sea counts as a communication cable for submarines or something. And these are the small issues that have to be reimagined when we're talking about cyber warfare. So this is, it's a bit overwhelming to sort of come across such a wide breadth of problems. So you start to feel a little bit enlightened. You say, okay, maybe I can put these problems into some wide buckets. So maybe if it's a function of political, social, and economic outcomes, you can start, mapping relationships to each other. And then, at some point after you've been doing 6 months of just pure reading and research and late nights and crying, you finally get to this, and you get this weird thesis that's the fifth dimension of warfare is intangible because the spatial and temporal planes are simultaneously condensed and stretched, which means nothing, right? But it actually means everything. And then the next stage is this. When my professors told me this, they warned me, oh yeah, you're gonna have to put this into a paper that looks kind of like that, and you realize you've read hundreds of articles, hundreds of newspaper, whatever. And yeah, so it feels a little bit like the house is burning down. And my professors also warned me about this too, because even after you do all that work, you get to this point where you have your thesis, and then you come across what's essentially the thesis, but in different words, but some other guy on the other side of the planet said it, and your reaction is just kind of yeah. And even after that, you think the process is done, it's fine. But you still reminded. So when you're a broke ass student and you don't have money, you're trying to find all that free research. So you got to put your actual email address in and get the influx of research papers. And then, sometimes you wake up to reminders of the experience that you went through with, little reminders like this. All I wanted to know is this going to result in nuclear warfare? I didn't need to know about the other 47,000, indicators of nuclear warfare. Thanks. So without further ado, I'll stop talking about myself, and I'll start off by describing what exactly is the fifth dimension, because it sounds very abstract. It sounds like maybe I'm trying to sell you some snake oil. It's actually a legit term that people use. So the first time that we really saw it was an Air Force chief said this quote or wrote this quote in one of the military sort of publications. And so he said that information has an ascending and transcending influence. So we're already, that's a pretty bold statement. And he decides that, it has an effect on society and our military forces, and that we should call it the information operations, also known as the fifth domain of warfare. And he closes by saying that this is going to be a really important thing to secure in the future, because it has, so much impact on society and the military. And luckily for him, this didn't, become some weird, like, obscure reference that you can only find by like Google dorking. It's actually pretty common. So you can find a reference to the fifth dimension like everywhere. You're probably wondering though, okay, if this is the fifth dimension, then what are the other four dimensions? What he means by the fifth dimension is in reference to the original four dimensions of warfare. So land, air, sea, and space. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Like, land is like tanks or whatever. Air is like planes flying through the air. Sea is like warships and submarines. Space, space stations and stuff like that. And then we have cyberspace. And so cyberspace is the new fifth domain that he's talking about. And this is different from what we call kinetic space. Kinetic space refers to the fact that things that happen in that space are tangible, so we can like see and feel them and, experience when they're happening. Cyberspace is a bit different because it happens so fast, and really, any actions that happen in cyberspace actually happen physically in like a small box in like a server room. And so it's not the same as, let's say, like a plane flying in the air with a bomb. You can't like see or feel or touch that, right? It doesn't have what they call a kinetic outcome or a kinetic consequence, which might be, like an explosion or something in other cases. When we talk about what exactly is unique about that fifth dimension, and to state it back into terms of that thesis I came up with that everybody else also kind of had, space and time stretch and condense. And what I mean by that is things can happen really fast and have like, explosive effects, or they can happen really slowly and still have the same effects. So if you think about, let's say, a missile flying through the air, and it's coming at you, if that missile goes faster, then the obvious implication is that the missile is going to reach you sooner, and then the damage that happens because of that missile happens sooner. In cyberspace, that doesn't happen. So if we think back to Stuxnet, that's like it illustrates this example really well, because when you think about the transmission of the actual malware from hop to hop, that only took like probably milliseconds to happen. But the actual damage that it did to the centrifuges, so if you're not that familiar with the Stuxnet event, that happened because the malware would make the centrifuges spin at a faster rate than they were supposed to, and hence wear out the equipment before it was supposed to. So, nobody noticed for a good almost a year until all these centrifuges started breaking down, and the staff at the nuclear facility were like, why do we have a bunch of centrifuges that broke down, way earlier than they were supposed to? And so it really paints the picture of this contrast where cyberspace allows, it does allow things to happen faster and have, larger, more kinetic outcomes, but it also gives you the option to slow things down, let it happen over time, and sort of let it happen under the radar, under the radar. This being said, you're probably, oh, I'm missing another slide somehow, sorry. So this being said, some doctrines have sort of asked, what exactly can we do to define this? And they sort of came up with a definition of a cyber attack. Sorry, 1 second. I just want to make sure this is the right slide. Oh, yeah, I just deleted an extra slide. I'm sorry. Going back from here. So the slide that I'm missing is a quote about cyber attacks, and essentially what sort of some legal scholars have tried to do is define, what a cyber attack is. And so, wait, I'm so sorry. Okay, this is supposed to come after. I did this really late at night last night. So, and I was like trying to cut stuff out because I had way too many slides. I know too much about the subject. Okay, there we go. So yeah, okay. Have this like space and time concept. But the question you have to ask, what even is cyber warfare, right? So there's a lot of agreement on different things that are cyber warfare. As you can see, this like wonderful mind map that we have, there's a lot of different things that come into play, whether that's like directly related to the military or sort of things that happen sublethally in the world. And the aspect of adding cyber to the word warfare actually becomes really complicated because warfare, implicates a lot of things. The word cyber, implicates digital technology, and everything is now has digital technology in it. So cyber implicates all of those things. It's a lot of things to implicate. When we look into how people define cyber warfare, we can first look at easy stuff on the internet. So Wikipedia is a great first example. They sort of say it's just basically anything that happens with technology in cyberspace. Not wrong, but doesn't really give us an accurate sort of depiction of what that is. Google gives us a little more of a grounded definition. They say that it needs to disrupt the activities of a nation state or some sort of large organization, and that there has to be this sort of concept that there's an intent of attacking them for like military advantage, because obviously cyber warfare or just warfare in general happens between nation states. And we can see Google also conveniently gives us a nice little graph of the term cyber warfare. So it's not, actually a new like buzzword term, although I'm, low-key kind of waiting for some Twitter account to be like, hey, do you want to buy my like AI blockchain, like cryptocurrency, cyber warfare protection? But we'll get there. The first occurrence of this actually came up when ARPANET was sort of being developed. So if you're not aware of what ARPANET is, it's like the OG internet that was used in the United States between all of the educational institutions and the military. So there was this basis of trust because you assume that everybody that was using it trusts, the other nodes on the network. And so a lot of papers that you can read from, publications at the time, they actually talk about how people were, proposing that cyber war was going to be a problem. But as anything happens in development, there's deadlines to be met, and no one wanted to, push back. No one wanted to block like the publication of the first ever internet. So, that got vetoed. It created more problems in the 1970s when the Morris worm came out. And even though that technically wasn't cyber warfare, a lot of people sort of threw around that term because it was the first sort of mainstream virus that ever happened. And then, I don't know why exactly there's a dip. We kind of stopped caring for a bit. And then all of a sudden in the last 2 decades, a lot of nation states have been going at it. So that's sort of where that starts again. Oh yeah, this was the missing slide. So what exactly is a cyber attack given those definitions? So this publication, which I'll talk about more in depth soon, it talks about sort of just warfare law in general, and they try to define cyber attacks. So they say that there's a concept of it being offensive or defensive, but the main component is really that it's expected to cause injury or death to persons or damage. I'm sorry, I don't. Okay, or destruction to objects. So you have to either essentially like people need to die or something needs to like get destroyed. So this is getting closer to what we think about generally. If we just think of the word war, that's probably pretty closely associated. But there's sort of some unanswered questions. The first one is how much damage, injury, death, or destruction do we actually need to call this a cyber attack? There's also to who and by whom are we actually doing this attack? And the last one is what are objects? Because objects could implicate like a lot of things that exist. So cyber warfare governance is a contentious legal issue. Yeah, even NATO. So as you're going to see the manual that they put out regarding this, it's confusing. They've got, some problems to sort out. I'll talk a little bit first about just international law in general. So we have this concept of the object and purpose of international law. So, international law is supposed to do something. They do things by providing a legal framework with working definitions, because as we all know, anything that needs to be regulated needs to be defined before we can enforce regulations on it. There's also a sense of encouraging legal obligation and state practice. So what that means is you want to enforce sort of like, what is the moral standard that nation states in the world will follow? And then we tell nation states that don't follow that standards that they're, bad, and then maybe sanctions happen, and that's sort of like the soft reinforcement that we have on it. There's this concept of state practice as well. So there might be laws, but for laws like in cyber warfare, where they're not very well developed, states are sort of expected, especially the more powerful states, to take precedent on events that happen in the world. So if they're the first ones to react to an incident, or if they're the first ones to perform some type of action, then other states will look at them and say, hey, look, that powerful guy's doing this thing, I can do it too. So you hope that really powerful states won't do like atrocious things, and then all of the other states follow. We also use international law to reduce conflict and mutual escalation. This concept essentially means when you have, let's say, two nation states or just entities in general interacting with each other, and they do something in that's like damaging to the other one, then the other one's going to respond in kind, essentially, or they're going to make an even worse response. So as that escalates, it becomes, let's say, like something like hacking can somehow escalate to like missiles and then like nuclear warfare, or that's sort of the conceptualization of that concept. And all of this sort of comes under the main goal of maintaining international peace. Now, I mean, there's a lot of contention over whether international law even works. If you're more of like a realpolitik sort of enthusiast, then you might say, well, none of this is even real. Like, we can't actually enforce this because there's no overarching government in the world to like, lay down the law and sort of punish other nation states. For the purpose of the rest of the presentation, we're just going to assume that like international law is like somewhat valuable. But that's sort of like the alternate view that we have. There's been like attempts at warfare regulations. So these are the three main ones. Not cyber warfare regulations, though, I should state clearly. So in the last couple of centuries, you've probably heard of like the Geneva Conventions, at least, and United Nations Charter. The Hague Conventions is another one, if you're more familiar with international law, that is sort of the other main component. And essentially, all of these try to regulate a couple different concepts. They try to talk about what happens before war, during war, and after war. So when you're talking about before war, it's sort of like, what is the premise where you are sort of morally allowed to start a conflict with someone else. The laws within war are, once a war is happening, what's like sort of not acceptable for causing unnecessary suffering or damage to people outside of the war. And then the last, post-war is when you talk about, okay, the war has happened, but we have to do all this cleanup because, everything's a mess. How are we going to deal with that? And so these three sort of doctrines are the main sort of international legal bodies that we talk about today. In cyber warfare, though, there are no rules. There's no, equivalent of the Geneva Conventions for cyber warfare. Even though we've had symposiums and stuff like that, it's not really the same nature where people like sat down for this exact purpose of creating like a doctrine of law that, multiple nation states actually sign into and agree to adopt. So, this has been recognized as like a real problem. So it's not to say that the Geneva Conventions will never happen, but there's been attempts to do so. And that quote that I had earlier, it comes from this book with this wonderful graphic that someone on the internet made. It's called the Talon Manual 1.0. And so this came about because when the 2007 Estonia Bronze Talon soldier attacks happened, this was a cyber attack over a disagreement of moving a war monument in Estonia. There was a lot of the hacks sort of aimed at like every single component of Estonia. It was like banks, banks and like corporations and like different sort of social institutions. And so people started realizing, this is going to be a problem later on. And so they just said, well, let's reimagine international law in the fifth dimension. And so a body of NATO that you can see there, as well as a couple other organizations that deal with international problems, they sort of like collaborated together to make this manual. And the main sort of sources that inspired this manual are warfare doctrines. So this might be stuff that like they actually give out to people in the military about like how to be, a soldier or whatever. They also had conventions and protocols and treaties. So that's like the Hague and Geneva Conventions. And then they had significant international court cases. So again, going along with that state precedent idea, if there have been past examples where there was a contentious issue and we didn't know how to solve it, let's look at, what the verdict was in past cases. And so it was a pretty good effort, but NATO decided at some point that it's not good enough because it only really focused on the idea of what's happening during war, and it totally neglected, what happens before war and after war. So the Talon Manual 2.0 came out, and if there's anything I can say about this book, it's that it's thick. Like, it's like 600 pages. I was gonna bring it and I forgot. I'm not on it today. I have it though. Like, if you want to see it after, it's like this thick. And it talks about everything. So it mentions, what happens during war, but there's also a lot of talk about just sort of other international humanitarian law concepts, like, do people have rights to digital privacy, or what sort of rights do they have in terms of like attacks that were caused by some sort of like hack or something. There's also like the weird stuff like I was talking about like, land, air, and sea space, and like how those exist in cyberspace, and what's the implication of hacking them versus like in the kinetic world would just maybe like bomb them or something. I don't know. I could go on forever. I'm not going to go on forever because this book is like, it's got so much stuff in it. Also, it's like mostly in Latin. I shouldn't say mostly, but it's got a lot of Latin in it. So yeah, it put me through some things. That's all I can say. So the Talon Manual is not official, and that's why it sort of has, I said it's not really a digital Geneva Convention. And it says this explicitly like in the preface. It's a sort of thought experiment for the people who made it. And they explicitly say that there is this sort of concept of what the manual is supposed to be. So lex lata, which essentially translates to the law as it exists, is sort of the focus of the Talon Manual. So they took all of these cases that have happened and sort of analyzed, this is the issue that has happened and this is how people would have dealt with it, or maybe this is the discourse that has been surrounding it. But it explicitly rejects the idea of being lex ferenda, which is the law as it should be. So what is the law in an ideal world? I'm going to go through a couple key concepts in the book and just show you, exactly what NATO doesn't know about cyber warfare. The first one is sovereignty. That's essentially, the idea that a nation state like owns all the stuff in its own state. So as we go through it, you'll see that it's very kinetic and geolocational, which doesn't really match up with cyber warfare because, as we know, cyberspace is a bit intangible. There's the concept of the use of force. So this is sort of the idea of like how much can you cause damage to another entity, and like when does it become acceptable or not acceptable? It's literally undefined. Military objects, again, going back to that objects concept, what exactly is an object in the context of law? And finally, we'll talk a bit about international actors because, as we all know, non-state actors are very powerful in cyberspace, but it doesn't really address that thoroughly. And before we begin, also, I'll just give you a quick picture. This is what a rule from the Talon Manual looks like. I honored the 12-year-old in myself and picked, cyber booby traps because that's hilarious. The rule itself is kind of boring though, so I was really disappointed. But essentially, you see the rule, it has a definition, and sort of it has numbered comments. And so essentially these comments will go through how this rule was derived, so which sources they sort of pulled from all that inspiration to define, what the rule is, and the terms in the rule. They talk about a majority and minority consensus. So the process of making this was actually to have a bunch of experts collaborate and sort of share thoughts on whether they agreed on like the statement of a rule. So sometimes not everybody agreed. So they'll talk about what the different viewpoints are. And then they'll outline difficult like scenarios related to the rule and sort of talk about the different nuances in them. So without further ado, let's go into sovereignty. I'm also going to have like a drink because this is going to be painful. Okay, sovereignty. So essentially what sovereignty means, and this was like it's a pretty old term. We came up with this concept of sovereignty when we talk about warfare, and it means that like a nation state has control over the things on its territory, specifically like its physical territory. So if something is within your borders, then like the king or whatever has, control over it. And so the first opening rule in the book is just the sovereignty as a general principle. And so the first definition says bluntly, sovereignty applies in cyberspace. So that's fine. The second one, this is like where it shows its antiquity because it talks about the supreme authority of the prince or king. If you look at monarchies, only like 43 out of 195 nation states have a monarchy. And it's actually like less monarchies than that because some of them have multiple nation states. So it's a pretty not current definition of, how the world actually runs. They sort of try to like brush it up by saying more modernly the state, but I just really want to show, that's sort of the gap in like where this term and concept has really come from. In one of the next comments, they say that sovereignty exists in the physical, logical, and social layers of cyberspace. So like at first that totally makes sense, right? But sovereignty has a lot of connections to other concepts in the manual, especially jurisdiction. And we already know as cyber experts, jurisdiction is complicated in cyberspace because you can have, let's say, a server, existing physically in one place, but then like the data on that server belongs to someone else. So when you talk about like just combining all of these layers and like a thing is in a certain nation state, this becomes a problem because we can't say that anything in cyberspace actually definitively is owned by whoever owns that territory around it. If someone, owns that data overseas, then this concept sort of falls apart. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the next concepts. So the next concept is the armed conflict and the use of force. Essentially, they tried to design words to sort of specifically talk about what counts as like an active war and what counts as less than that. And I'll map it out for you just to make it easier to imagine as we go through some of the quotes. Essentially, someone can start out with an armed attack, and this grants them the right to do self-defense. And so self-defense is essentially an action that is equally damaging as the armed attack that happened to you. And then once self-defense happens, this initiates like an armed conflict. And over time, this will happen repeatedly. So we can see armed conflict is like an overarching, essentially like war. And then the sort of single instances of battles are what they would call armed conflict or self-defense. So, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? But once we get to actually sort of defining this, it falls apart a little bit. So the definition of an armed conflict, according to the manual, is that it's a hostility between two or more states. That's fine. We get to the next one, though, and it sort of says that like we don't really know what threshold of violence sort of counts as armed attack. And this becomes really problematic because, as we all know in cyberspace, a lot of things can happen with different sort of levels of damage, and it can also happen not instantly, as going back to that space and time concept. So the manual sort of tries to address this by saying, some of these operations can count as an armed attack, even if they don't instantly, destroy lives or buildings. They can cause serious suffering or death, such as in the case of, let's say, the equivocal chemical, radiological, or biological attacks. The question is, though, how many lethal attacks have actually happened to date? And we don't really know. There's no official statistics on this. I could only find one case, which I will talk about later, where people may have died, and it's not even, like, you can't even find the death count. So for them to sort of outline this concept, we're assuming that an active war is, like, leads to death and extreme damage. It kind of, makes you question, is cyber warfare even real then? Because we don't even know if there are any attacks that fall under this category. The Talon Manual and international law try to also address this concept of being under the threshold of armed attack. So they call this the use of force. And what they say is that, the definition of use of force is that it's any sort of action that is against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So that's pretty straightforward. Like if you do something to a state and they're a sovereign state, they're supposed to be allowed to do whatever they want as a state. And so if you stop them from being able to do that, that becomes a use of force. Now, when you get to defining the use of force, though, this is no longer true. We say, okay, the scale and effects of use of force, essentially the nature of the use of force, needs to rise to the level of use of force. So, kind of quotes itself. And then the next comment says there is no authoritative definition of the use of force. So this is not really useful, right? However, it does explicitly say within that same comment that we don't include economic coercion, psychological operations, terrorism, or espionage in the use of force. So this really makes you question, like, what is the use of force? Because we already said it's not an act of war. We already said that, like, it has sublethal effects, but like most of the things that cause sublethal effects are like exactly those four things. I don't know what else you would call them. So this is kind of problematic. To visualize it, just to summarize the concept, we have armed conflict up there. There's injury, death, destruction. That sort of implies armed conflict. Under this is the use of force. It's literally undefined, but it's not that bad. But it's not any of those things. So what is the use of force then, like in that middle area? I don't know. Okay, the next concept I'll talk about is military objects. This was like hands down the weirdest one that I like went through. You start like seeing these papers about like, the root of the word object and like the fact that it was created in like international law in like modern Europe, and they start like analyzing like different languages and like what object means. Like, is it like object like thing or like object like objective? And so it sort of like makes you have this like existential questioning about everything. And it's a problem that also exists when we talk about cyberspace. So this rule, defines objects and military objectives. The definition has a few different components. So one is that they're not military objectives. So, okay, we can create this like very easy graph. They're not the other thing. They're mutually exclusive. It says their nature, location, purpose, or use has to be for the military. So that makes sense. It's like the difference of like a tank is like probably obviously used for the military, whereas, I don't know, something else is not. And that this sort of object has to contribute to gaining some sort of military advantage. And finally, it ends by saying cyber infrastructure may qualify as a military objective. So like at a base level, this makes sense, right? Like one is not the other. That's great. But then when you think of computers, it becomes more complicated. So if you think of, let's say, again, the tank is very clearly a military object. A civilian object might be, I don't know, like a spoon or something. Like that's not a military object. But when you talk about computers, someone can sit down at their computer and they can send, like world-destroying malware, or they can send just like check their emails. And so now how do we classify the computer? It's just, it can be used for both. It's a dual use sort of object. And so that would live somewhere in the middle of those two things. And this becomes problematic because we use military objects to sort of scope out what is acceptable to attack during war. And then when computers come along, we have this question of like, well, it's used for personal things, but it's also used for military advantage. So now, are all computers sort of like safe from military warfare, or are they automatically included? And as you all know, attribution is a problem. So it's really hard to definitively say that like a computer can be used just for one or the other. And so it kind of addresses that in the next comments. They say that the entire internet could like conceptually become a military objective if it was used for military purposes. The irony is that like originally it was used for military purposes, but it's really unlikely that the entire internet would become, used for military purposes. So now we have this question of like, okay, it's not a question that people use the internet for things that we would call cyber warfare today. But now this international legal concept is saying that unless like literally the entire internet is used for that, then it's just a civilian object. And so this, it asks the question, like, what exactly can we use the internet for or not for? And how does this let cyber events that cause damage fly under the radar because we haven't considered like it to be a military object. It's not like a thing that happens in warfare. The final concept is that of actors. So I'm sure you all like saw that Trump tweet at some point. You know, everybody thinks like hackers are interesting people. The thing is though, like they have a lot of power, as you all probably know. There's like tons of malware that spread worldwide and, you know, messed a bunch of things up like WannaCry. You know, that was created essentially by like 2 people. The Talon manual doesn't really address this. So from a high level, this is essentially sort of the different types of, let's say, if you have 2 nation states, sort of what classifications of actors, the permutation of which actors they are. So you can have, you know, it's an international conflict which falls under international law, and that is because it's a state interacting with another nation state. There's also this concept of non-international law, which they sort of mention in the Talon manual, but don't, you know, thoroughly go through. And this falls under domestic law. And so this is interactions either between a nation state and a non-state actor, or it's just 2 non-state actors. The thing is, though, we all know that, you know, cyber attacks can be heavily damaging. So it seems kind of unfair to like consider this domestic law if something like WannaCry, you know, spreads across the world to different countries. In one of the rules against about self-defense, so they don't have any rules specifically about actors, but they talk about it in other rules. There's a lot of contention over what this really means. They start off in this rule by saying that the issue of whether non-state actors can actually be an armed attack is not really defined. But then they also say that when 9/11 happened, this was characterized as an international attack. It was seen as like an attack on the nation state by like another country, even though it was technically like a terrorist group that wasn't, you know, acting under the state. And then they further say that states have sort of established a practice of having being able to act in self-defense. So that means, again, you know, reacting in kind, causing the same amount of damage when it happens by non-state actors without the involvement of a state. So that sounds great, but like there's so many clauses in the Talon manual that talk about that not being allowed. And then so they say there's just significant uncertainty regarding, you know, how organized a group has to be to mount an armed attack. So as you are probably aware, there's different levels of organization. You know, you can have like one person that's a non-state actor, or you can have, let's say, like a hacktivist group and maybe they're a little bit disorganized, or you can have, you know, really organized terrorist groups. And so essentially they've said we really just don't know what to do about any of those groups unless it's like very clearly a nation state that presents itself as a state. So given all of these sort of issues I've talked about, none of them are really well defined. We can ask, you know, what exactly is the nature of cyber warfare? We don't know. But I can tell you at least sort of some of the cyber warfare events that have happened in the real world, and maybe you can make your own judgment. So we'll talk about a couple different things where there may have been kinetic consequences to cyber attacks and sort of the nuances of how using the rules in the manual, this would look if we tried to organize it in a sort of like metric. In the real world, I'll just talk briefly. These are the significant cyber players today. So, I mean, if you read the news at all, you're probably aware of this already. These are the 6 nation states that sort of invest the most into cyber warfare or cyber defense technology, or have been exchanging blows in cyberspace. The couple that I've focused on, I was going to do all 3 of these cases, the Ukrainian power grid attacks, the DNC hack, and Hamas versus Israel. Turns out I had like way too many slides and I know too much about this, so I had to cut out Ukraine power grid attack, but you can think about it after because you'll see the methodology, how it happens, and sort of think about what it means to attack a power grid. So the first one is the Democratic National Committee hack. And I'm sure you've probably all at least heard of this at some point. I won't go too thoroughly through all of the events because, like, if you've been following it all, it's just way too complex. There's so many things happening at any given time, so many parties interacting. over the course of 2 years, but I'll give you some of the main events. Whoops. So we have the DNC. We have the Bears from Russia. They sent a spear phishing email to some people at the DNC. Specifically, in 2015, they sent these two, the X-Agent and X-Tunnel malware. And in 2016, Fancy Bear sent CDaddy and PowerShell. I was gonna put icons for that, but then I thought, representing X-Agent and X-Tunnel is kind of hard. I don't want to try to represent CDaddy. That's not going to work out well for me. But anyways, they sent these two malware samples. Allegedly, they actually didn't know anything about each other attacking it, so they were like separate operations from Russia. And they sort of exfiltrated some things. What this resulted in is them knowing a lot about the DNC. And so the first sort of big result was the WikiLeaks document leaks. There were I think there were 2 separate leaks. One of them was like the 20,000 emails and 8,000 attachments. The other one was another like 58,000 documents. So that was like, a lot of bad press for the DNC, especially with election day coming up. They also found when they investigated this, so there were several third-party investigations by like Mandiant and FireEye and a ton of other organizations, as well as by the NSA. And they found eventually that the Russian sort of intel bodies, they had done a bunch of different information operations. And so one of them was that they bought a bunch of targeted ads and they sent them to specific areas in the United States where there was sort of a pro-Trump sort of consensus. They also tried to support the pro-Trump consensus by creating this slogan. So it was associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's very contentious for a lot of reasons. But essentially, they didn't even try to do anything specific. They just tried to blow this out of proportion and make it a bigger deal so that more people were divided about the issue. And then finally, they found that they had actually planned, in case Hillary won, they had planned sort of like a campaign of spreading this hashtag, the democracy rest in peace, just to sort of give a final last blow. The outcome of this is sort of, there's a consensus that, yeah, this did influence the election, but it's kind of weird too, because no one directly hacked the election. No one directly tried to hack the voting machines or the servers that maybe collected the data about it. So that puts it in a really weird place. The attribution that happened afterwards, as I mentioned, the third-party investigations, the NSA very clearly stated, we know this is Russia. Obama put sanctions on a bunch of Russian diplomats too and sent them home, and Putin was not very happy about that. They attributed specific groups, so the Internet Research Agency is sort of the one that has the troll factories and whatnot, and the main intelligence directorate, which is abbreviated as the GRU, because that's how the words work in Russian. And that's sort of their main intel body. Putin denied this all the time. He suggested that maybe, it wasn't us. There was patriotic hackers that sort of, were non-state actors. And he stated he also had sanctions in response to Obama's sanctions, and he cited that it was just a bad relations sort of scenario. So it's interesting though, because all of these would sort of say, a nation state hasn't adopted responsibility on Russia's side. So, and that's the sort of the prerequisite if you're talking about cyber warfare. It's both of the nation states have to assert themselves as owning a piece of this conflict and engaging in it together. Despite this, there's this sort of general agreement that this was cyber warfare. So you can go just on the internet and look up the DNC hack, and there's so many headlines that sort of point to the fact that this is cyber warfare. If you actually try to break it down, it's not that easy to assert. So we can ask, okay, is this an armed attack? There was no direct kinetic consequences in terms of violence or death, so probably not. Election tampering, though, I mean, now you have to ask, what does the word violence mean? Is tampering with the democratic rights of a people a sort of act of violence per se. You can ask whether it's a use of force, and this can be, I don't know, it can be seen as yes, but it can also seen as no. So if you talk again about that prerequisite of territorial integrity or political independence, you would think like hacking an election is a pretty clear sort of breach of, someone else's territorial integrity. That being said, though, in the same definition, we exclude psychological and media manipulation, which is really how all of this attack happened. There was no attack on the actual infrastructure that, underheld the election itself. Is it state to state? We would think yes, because like everyone attributed Russia, and it seems like pretty clear that it's Russia. But on the Russian side, they denied the attribution. And again, you need to explicitly say that, it was me that engaged in this act of warfare. So yes, but also no. And then finally, military objects are, again, confusing, because going back to what I was saying, you have to ask, are the DNC targets civilian themselves? Is this technically like, because they're part of a government, does that make them like a military object? And you also have to ask the civilians that were part of this, so the people where they saw the social media campaigns and whatnot, were they actually an operational object? Can you count just like civilians as a military strategy, or are they normal people that, shouldn't be included in war? And also, I didn't mention this here, but like also generally, again, is the internet, like, is it a military object itself, or do we need to preclude the entire internet to call it war? So it's the verdict on this is that we don't really know. This might be cyber warfare. It might not be. Pretty much every category says like it's confusing. I personally would put it as I'm sort of middle ground between cyber operation and cyber warfare, because again, hacking something like an election is sort of central to like what a nation state does. But at the same time, no one died. Nothing was, destroyed physically. So maybe not. The second case study happened conveniently. I shouldn't say conveniently. It happened really recently, back in May 2019. And it didn't have a lot of press, so you might have not heard of it. It was an exchange between Hamas, which is a religious group, and that occupies the Gaza Strip, and Israel. So this one is a bit simpler of a scenario. You have Hamas, there's hackers. They send a cyber attack to Israel, and Israel responds by posting this tweet one day. So essentially they sent a missile strike to this building in response to this alleged cyber attack. The cyber attack, we don't know anything about the nature of it, at least not publicly. So we don't know, how long it happened, or what kind of damage it did to Israel's assets or anything like that. The airstrike itself happened in May 2019. Israel sort of explicitly attributed itself about the airstrike. So if you read like one of the translated website pages, they say that, they caught the operation coming from the Gaza Strip, and they noticed that it was trying to damage their assets. And so after that, they decided to not only handle the cyber dimension, but also the physical dimension. So this seems like maybe, okay, it should be closer to warfare, cyber warfare, because there was some damage. I think it's interesting, though, the contrast towards the DNC hack is that no one really says it's cyber warfare. You got that like one word article up there that says maybe it's cyber war, or it means something for the future of cyber war. But all of the other things call it a cyber attack or something similar. If you break it down, we also see that even though there was kinetic destruction, there's sort of contention around this. So was it an armed attack? This becomes difficult because now you have to argue, are you going to consider the whole conflict as like one thing, or are you going to divide like the cyber attack versus the kinetic attack? So if you want to talk about, both of them together, there was definitely a kinetic response. Allegedly, some people in the building died, and also the property was destroyed. However, we don't know if the cyber initiation attack was sort of at the same degree of damage. We don't know if it would have warranted like an act of self-defense. If we look at the use of force, all armed attacks are uses of force. It's just like a worse use of force. But again, we still don't know about the cyber attack, so we can't say like the cyber attack itself was a use of force. We can ask, okay, did this happen between states? This one's interesting too, especially because a lot of cyber warfare attacks happen between like either just hacktivist groups and like a state or like, two nation states. Hamas is kind of special because it's what they call a sub-state actor. It has occupied this space and it's not officially a government, but it sort of like has taken over the functions of a government for quite a while. So now we have to ask, it basically does what a government does, but like technically, if we wanted to count this as an act of war, it's not going to be. And then finally, whether it's a military object, we don't know exactly what the cyber attack attacked. We can assume though maybe it was part of the IDF's assets, so that would make it a military object. And it's unclear if that, so they, mentioned in the thing that the headquarters that was attacked is like a headquarters for Israel, but we don't really know if it's like an official military headquarters. So whether or not those two count as, military objectives is contentious. My final verdict on it is that the cyber component is not cyber warfare because, again, there was no explosive damage that happened at the end. That being said, though, the kinetic response is unlawful because if there was no explosive damage from the cyber attack, then, it's not really fair for them to act in self-defense by destroying lives and a building. And so if we want to just map this out, I'm just going to summarize all of this. Taking the same issues, did it count as any of these things? You can see there's a lot more X's and question marks than there are check marks. And so really the point I'm trying to get to is that the sort of framework that we try to use to define this, it doesn't do the job. We're still very confused. And NATO is pretty confused too. So what exactly do we need given all of this? We've established that it doesn't really work. We probably need something new because cyber warfare is going to become a bigger issue. It's not going to stop. The first sort of ideal thing that should happen is that someone needs to sort of create a metric or risk framework to define all of these things, because you can't have a regulation if you don't have definitions for all of the things that exist in the regulation. And there's been like suggested things in the Talon manual. They talk about some sort of things about the use of force and like maybe some metrics, but none of them have been official. And even when they sort of talk about these different subsections, they mention explicitly in the rules like how contentious it is to sort of adopt this. A kind of like related issue in one of the other cyber attacks talked about, is it physically damaging to a computer if you destroy its operating system, or like what level of damage to the software on it, counts as like destruction to the object. So these are the kinds of things that we need to sort out before we can decide this. The second one is to include non-state and sub-state actors in this equation, because again, as we all know, significant world ramifications can come from attacks that are caused by just one person. So it really doesn't make sense to only observe how this happens between nation states. If anything, it happens more between, non-state actors. And then finally, we need to sort of resolve this dichotomy between the military and civilian objects, because essentially all computers are contentiously, both and neither at the same time. So it becomes really hard to regulate, what are we allowed to attack and what are we not allowed to attack if we don't make a decision on how we're going to define these objects. At a more meta level, there's meta conclusions. The expansion of the temporal and spatial planes are non-dichotomic. And so in general, like if we were to make a new legal framework, just any concept in it cannot be, defined by a dichotomy. It doesn't work anymore because, again, with this whole condensing and stretching idea in space and time, pretty much any concept that you conceive in that space is not going to work. There's like a weird conclusion about extra dimensions. Like, I don't know, I think it's pretty significant that we just like decide to like call another dimension something. It makes me wonder, they were talking about that in the 1950s. Now it's almost 2020. Quantum computing is basically at that stage. They say, if it's going to work out, it's going to work out in 50 years. So just waiting for the quantum dimension to happen. That's going to be crazy. And then finally, international law cannot just rely on being kinetically based. So, the base concept of all of this law was sovereignty. That's a kinetic concept that cannot happen anymore. We need to create something new. On a more practical level, sort of the steps that we could take to do this, solve those like framework conceptual loopholes. Again, all of those contentious definitions where we weren't really sure what happened. Make good cyber Geneva conventions. Like everyone kind of recognizes that like everybody needs to really collaborate on this and do something about it, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't know why. And finally, make the framework actually official, because the Talon Manual does, as much as it has its issues, it's a pretty solid reimagination of like what's actually happening now, but none of it is really it's not going to help when actual events happen and are evaluated if it's not official, because nation states have to agree that they actually want to follow it for it to have any use in that space. So yeah, that's kind of the end of my overview. Question and answer time. Now's your time to roast me.
Hello. Do you ever think that the reason why we don't have policies yet is because the generation that would be making these policies are not aware of like cyber technology in general?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, and so, before I even did this research as like a capstone, I came across that idea. They explicitly say in a lot of research articles, the issue is like a lot of people who are making laws in international law and working at the policy level just simply have not been around to experience technology as like, younger people growing up today do. And it's both that they're younger and also because law experts are not IT experts. And I think what needs to happen is we need to include IT experts more in this discussion. They technically did in the Talon Manual. It was like 18 international law experts and like 2 IT experts. So not a really good balance when you think of it. And I think it really shows in how some of those rules were laid out.